Hello, and welcome to this week's reflections on the Acts of the Apostles. We are in chapter 21. We have made it through about 19 verses of that chapter, so we continue today, picking up at verse 20. But first, to kind of recap that when we left off last time, we had Paul making his report to the council in Jerusalem, if you will, and the reaction of the council when they heard Paul's report was that they glorified God. Paul gives all credit to God in the work that was done through him, not by him. And that is something that I think we need to absorb in our thinking, so that when we can accomplish something for God, we realize that it is God working through us rather than us doing it and then God kind of going, yay, you. So the praise goes to God, and that is where we left off, in that the praise for God in this case was Paul proclaiming the gospel message to Gentiles. So not only was Paul giving credit to God for the work that was done, but also the Jerusalem council of the new followers of the way were praising God for the spread of the gospel to Gentiles. So these are Jews in Jerusalem praising God that the word of God is getting out to the Gentiles, which was something they were called to do as the people of Israel in the first place. So, starting now at verse 20, chapter 21. And this is where it's going to get rocky for Paul. So in a kind of a full spiritual unity here, the elders of the church in Jerusalem point out to Paul that massive numbers of Jews, all of them, zealous for the law, passionate, or a little more than just, yeah, we obey the law, have become believers. And these may be converted Pharisees that were mentioned in Acts 15:5. Literally, zealots for the law. They lived out their loyalty to God by combining ardent nationalism with strict observance of the whole Mosaic code. So we have Phinehas, Elijah, and the Maccabees. These were all the predecessors of this group or this sect within Israel, within the Jews in Jerusalem. These now have been converted to followers of the way. It doesn't mean they gave up their heritage, as we've already mentioned, but these converts have been particularly troubled by reports that Paul has been teaching displaced Jews. The Jews are often the diaspora, those who have been scattered during the exiles, to turn away from Moses, which is a very hard thing. This is their tradition, this is their heritage, and you know how your own congregation feels about its traditions, and change becomes anathema to them. So this phrase translates a Greek word, apostasia, which we would call apostasy. And that refers either to a political or a spiritual kind of rebellion, in that apostasy means to turn away from. So in this case, Paul is being accused of turning away from his heritage and tradition as a Jew. Not only that, but also politically and religiously. So remember, being a Jew, you were ethnically or nationally a Jew, you were also religiously a Jew. So Paul is alleged to have instructed these Jewish believers to stop having their children circumcised and to stop walking according to the Jewish customs, as it were. Well, it's easy to see how such implications might be drawn from Paul's teachings of a law-free gospel, There's no evidence that Paul ever instructed Jewish Christ followers in this way. In fact, Paul was most scrupulous to not offend the conscience of the weak believer. As a trained Pharisee and a Jewish Christ follower himself, Paul maintained ancestral customs, even went so far as to have Timothy, his prodigy, circumcised, so they could both enter the Jewish synagogues wherever they traveled to proclaim the good news about the Messiah Jesus. So one of the most disturbing things I have repeatedly faced in my own years of being a pastor is when people have just a small piece of a story and then they write their own conclusions or the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say, instead of speaking directly to the specific person that the story involves and at least getting more of the story, if not all of the story. One person creates a conclusion and then they tell that next person, and then that next person creates more of a story or a conclusion, and then they tell the next person, and this goes on and on and on until the original facts of what was said are so distorted that there's little left to recognize as truth. We will see that specifically and especially in verse 28, where some Jews are stirring up a riot against Paul, using false accusations and writing their own conclusions that Paul brought Greeks into the temple courtyards. Now, there was a courtyard specific for Gentiles, and then next to that, there was a courtyard specific for women, and then even further in from that, there was the courtyard for male Jewish believers. So, in a polite church society, this kind of activity, which I tend to call gossip, can be called just being concerned. And I am sure that these Jews who want Paul arrested would say that they are just being concerned about their friends and neighbors who might be led astray and want to protect their religious practices and their traditions. The problem is that their zealous concern, their passion for their own traditions, has led them down a road filled with deceit and slander, which are tools of the devil. Too many religious people, Christians included, justify deceit and slander to accomplish their desired end. Something like the ends justify the means. That's not always true. Every time this happens, people abandon God's plan and they follow their own plan, or, I hope unwittingly, are following Satan's plan. Proverbs 16:28 reads, "A perverse person stirs up conflict, and a gossip separates close friends." Proverbs 26:20 reads, "Without wood, a fire goes out. Without a gossip, a quarrel dies down." Now listen to the group of people in which the Apostle Paul includes gossips, which this letter probably was written after his experience in Jerusalem that we'll get to in a little while. In Romans 1:29 and 30, he writes, "They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful." That's quite a indictment. Whatever we call it, this kind of activity does exactly what Satan wants it to do. It divides people, it divides the church, the body of Christ. So, what can be done to overcome this kind of behavior, which honestly always threatens to bring disunity to the church. I'm sure you will have ideas and possibly can share them with other people within your own congregation if you're not part of Redeemer, where I'm at. I can give you an idea about how I handle it when someone comes to me alleging something another person has done. And I will tell you, it's not my idea. It's not. Rather, this teaching comes directly from Jesus in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, chapter 18, verses 15 through 17. If you haven't already read it, I encourage you to. But Jesus tells us, how do we act in relationship with one another? Jesus says, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. But if they will not listen, then, step 2, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Then, if they still do not witness, or they still do not listen to you, step 3, if they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And step 4, and if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Now, so imagine someone from the church comes to you and says, did you hear what Pastor Allman did? I'll only use myself as an example here. Considering what Jesus says in these verses, how would you respond? Well, Jesus provides that 4-step process. None of those steps include spreading more gossip. Regarding the 4th step, I like to remind people to think about how Jesus treated pagans and tax collectors, right? Think about it a moment. Jesus ate meals with them and invited them to become followers. So this 4th step doesn't mean that you disregard them and you cast them out. It means you just start to treat them a little bit differently and welcome them and invite them to come and see Jesus, to get involved in the family of God. And Jesus did that, sometimes to the chagrin of the religious leaders. So the church leaders here, again specifically the Jerusalem Council, they give Paul some advice on how to combat these words, this gossip, if you will, with actions. 4 pious men in the congregation have taken on themselves a Nazirite vow of limited duration, according to what they learned from Numbers chapter 6, by abstaining from products of the vine, wine basically, not cutting their hair, and avoiding ritual impurity. They have been showing thankfulness for some kind of blessing that they have received. They are earnest in their petition, or again, there is a strong devotion to God in this. The multi-animal sacrifice and cleansing ceremony at the end of the vow period, when the hair is cut off and offered to God, could be financially prohibitive to many people. Numbers chapter 6, verses 14 and 15 say that they must bring to the temple a year-old male lamb without defect for burnt offering, a year-old ewe lamb without defect for a sin offering, a ram without defect for a fellowship offering, together with their grain offerings and drink offerings, a basket of bread made with the finest flour and without yeast, thick loaves made with olive oil mixed in, thin loaves brushed with olive oil. That's 7 pretty significant offerings. That would be a great burden for someone that would not be considered wealthy. So Paul is asked to bear that expense for all 4 of these men. So 4 times the amount that I just read. To do so, Paul himself must go through a 7-day ritual cleansing because he's recently returned from Gentile nations and working with Gentiles on the gospel. So add a 5th one, Paul himself, to each of those things I just read. Now, you may imagine how expensive this will be if you multiply that amount by 5. 7 different types of offerings multiplied by 5. Now let me give you maybe a personal way of looking at this. Consider your own average financial offering, maybe even just for a week or month, however you give. Multiply that by 7. And then take that amount that you just multiplied to receive the sum, whatever that is, and multiply that by 5, because Paul had to do this for 5 people. I would imagine that once you calculate all that, that amount would equal more than you give all year. Now, let me tell you why I think that. Because I did that. I multiplied my tithe, and I do tithe, by 7 for a month, and then multiplied that amount by 5. It equaled more than 3 times the amount I give in my annual offering. Now, since this is a special offering, that is over and above what Paul's normal tithes and offerings would be. Now do you start to understand how cost prohibitive this may be? And also you may understand that the intended result is this is such an enormous undertaking that the rumors about Paul will be shown to be baseless, and he will be seen living in obedience to the law, just so that Paul's action not be misunderstood in another direction as making Jewish custom normative for Gentile Christians. The elders, the Jerusalem Council, hasten to add that they've already given a decree to Gentiles, and that decree is still in place. It's repeated here in its essential detail. So the next day, Paul begins his own ritual purification, declares to the temple authorities the date that the Nazirite vow, here called the days of purification in verse 26, would be completed through a sacrificial ceremony for the 5 men, which includes Paul. So what does this tell us about Luke's view of Christians and their religious past? Why do we even care? Well, before we can draw on general principles, we must deal with significant factors concerning the Jewish law. At its core was this divine revelation in 3 characteristic traits: moral, civil, and ceremonial. Surrounding that were oral traditions, an interpretation of the written law, and rabbinic teachings, what the well-noted rabbis taught and wrote down. A rabbi, in this case, has pastoral duties, such as leading a congregation in prayer, preaching duties, such as delivering a weekly ceremony or a sermon, message of some type based on a text, interpretive duties, that is, interpreting the Torah, the written law, and administrative duties. He has to run the congregation. So Luke's use of the terminology can often prevent us from easily distinguishing which aspects of the law he's referring to. We're not that steeped in Judaism. Still, Luke's use of the term customs does seem to show us that he is aware of some differences between what is divine revelation and what is human tradition. We have that in our own congregations. And there may be a distinction in Luke's thinking between the moral, the ceremonial, and the civil aspects, which will enable us to make decisions about what is normal, if there is such a thing, based on the content that we're reading here from Luke. If we strictly focus on divine revelation component of a Jewish Christ followers' religious past, we have the Old Testament law, what they would call the Hebrew law, or the Torah. Luke says that has no relevance for salvation. What? While the moral aspect is universally normative. Luke also sees a positive use for the ceremonial laws to aid the Jewish Christ followers in the expression of their piety. There was no normative way for a Christ follower to worship. Gentiles would worship differently than Jews. Jews would go back to their own expression of piety, which may include the animal sacrifices. So Luke doesn't make laws binding on the Gentiles. Only when Gentiles are in the company of Jewish Christ followers should they have the kind of scruples about keeping ceremonial ritual purity, then Luke says we should abide by, or at least consider their ways of worship normative for them, as long as what they are projecting does not exceed what God has mandated in the Old Testament for foreigners living in Israel. Are you following me on all this? I know it can get confusing, but right now in this century, there's a blending of Jewish Christ followers still adhering to their traditions and Gentile Christ followers who don't understand everything they do, but they don't. Jewish Christ followers won't hold Gentile Christ followers to anything more so than they would any other foreigner living in Israel. I hope this is making sense, because it does give us some kind of guidelines for how do we interact with others today. There is in a large measure some freedom, and the freedom is to be used to promote, one, the advance of the gospel, and two, the unity that needs to be formed within an ethnically diverse congregation or body of Christ. Are you starting to see how this works together? It had to work together in the first century. It has to work together in this 21st century. So long as our conscience is not bound by non-Christian traditions and practices, and the Christian gospel is not syncretized, that is, commingled to the point that the thought behind the non-Christian practice or our pre-Christian religious practice, for those who have one, goes against what Jesus has taught us. There is a lot of work here, and I'm not trying to make it sound simple, but I hope you can understand what I'm saying. What we have to do in the body of Christ to kind of understand each other and where each of us is coming from will move us into a transformed spiritual future, not to violate Jesus' teachings for us in the basic love God and love one another kinds of things that he said were the two greatest commandments. Whew. So we're now at 21 verse 27 and following. And even back then, as maybe now some are saying, how are we even going to survive this? That may have been a pressing question for the Jews in that generation, who had to be wondering, well, now we're called to follow this Messiah, and this Messiah is allowing Gentiles in, so what's going to happen to us? First century Jews may have seen Paul's Gentile mission as a threat to their religious survival, for it effectively erased the dividing line between Jew and Gentile within the body of Christ, within the people of God. The eternally decisive issue may be, which people of God does God intend to survive. Sometimes it may feel like that within our own denominations. As we look at other denominations and what they're doing and what impact they're having on society, we may start to think, how are we even going to survive all of this? Well, the eternal decisive issue may not be, well, which people of God is going to survive, but maybe rather to ask, does one have to cease being the chosen people of God? Maybe an easier way to say it is, why can't we all just get along? So, looking at my time here, I got a couple more minutes. I'll try to take you through some quick stuff here. Toward the end of the 7-day purification process, probably the 7th day itself, when he will receive what's called the water of atonement, we might call it baptism, Paul is in the temple. Jews from Asia, or Asia Minor, not Asia like Japan or Korea or whatever, but north of Syria, Jews from Asia see him there. And to them, this is kind of an unusual sight because they're not used to seeing Paul doing these kinds of religious ceremonies in the Jewish world. So from time to time of his witness in the Ephesian synagogue, Paul has faced constant opposition from the Asian Jews, and now, under cover of a Pentecost pilgrimage, they have dogged his steps to Jerusalem. They're all heading to Jerusalem for the same purpose. And now in 27 we hear they stirred up the crowd so that a mob scene is following Paul. They seized Paul as they broadcast their charges against him. These Asian Jews are raising a general charge against Paul's teaching. It opposes our people and our laws and this place, meaning the temple. That is how in Acts we don't get a recording of what Paul's views on the temples were, but Paul does say the law itself is unable to set one free from sin or bring forgiveness. But he always went to the synagogues first in all of his teachings. Paul does not teach against the people, it says, but it means the Jews. Rather, the Jews who opposed Paul and the gospel, the good news of the fulfillment of the promises made to their ancestors through the Messiah Jesus, their opposition to what Paul is preaching calls into question whether they are part of the true people of God. Is this getting more muddy all the time? So any opposition to the gospel now is a revelation of the persecutor's choice, in this case the people who persecuted Paul, and not a valid judgment against the message itself. So next time, I'm going to stop there, but next time we'll get into some of the stuff that's happening in the temple. So the next time we get together, you might want to have in front of you maybe a diagram of what the temple would have looked like in this time frame. So you can do a Google search or whatever search engine you use. You can find a diagram of the temple. Maybe just keep it off to the side if you can split screen your computer screen. Just so when I'm talking about the court of the Gentiles, the court of the women, the court of the Israel men, and stuff like that, you have kind of a picture in your mind of what I'm talking about. So thank you for joining me here again today. The next time we take this up, we're going to get into more specifics about what happened to Paul in the temple, his arrest, and moving forward. If you're in the Sun City Center area, feel free to join us for worship on Sunday at 10 a.m. If you're not, and you want to join us for worship online, you can do that. We live stream our service starting at 10 a.m., or you can pick it up later in the week on our YouTube channel. But thank you. Hope you're having a great week. Take care, and God bless.